Rubio is no Witkoff in this way. He wasn't having anything of it. He knew nothing had changed and that Russia was still bent on conquest and destroying Ukraine. Therefore, and I bet the three colleagues, money was not exchanged, that the thing won't happen in Budapest on the 28th. It will be, pardon my not French, but deep Latin. It will be postponed sine die. It will be, well, it's postponed. It's not cancelled. The stars didn't align, and it's very muddy and whatever.
Welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1337, and I'm keeping a tally of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're in a Trump-Putin merry-go-round, or a bit of a phony war at the moment, waiting for Trump and Putin to meet. But we're very fortunate to be speaking to an old friend of the show, Robert Fox. Now, Robert's the defence editor of the Evening Standard and a commentator on all matters defence and security, I think. You're an honorary fellow of the Strategic Studies Institute at Exeter University, an associate fellow of the Centre for Defence Studies at KCL, and, as I said, commentator on foreign affairs, defence, and anything else that you seem to be being asked to comment on. Robert, welcome back to the show.
Hello.
We're in this, as I said, phony war, waiting for Trump and Putin to meet. We're getting lots of reports out of Washington that when Trump met Zelensky, that was just after he'd had a phone call with Putin. The Trump-Zelensky meeting behind closed doors ended up a bit of a shouting match. What are you making of all of this?
Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting is, well, we know what the Trump game is. It's very simple. It's snap when other people are trying to play 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional chess. Trump wants to repeat what he sees as his great triumph over getting Gaza ceasefire. He did get a Gaza ceasefire, but how cease it is going to be, it's really open to question with the resurgence of Hamas, with the pushback of the Israelis, and the big questions now really being addressed about Gaza. In his search for the Nobel Peace Prize and the bringer of peace to 8 or 9 conflicts, because he claims to have settled 7 already, he's now focusing on Ukraine. Unfortunately, many of the protagonists, not all, some are, many of the protagonists in Ukraine are not focusing on Trump. They're not expecting deliverance from Trump. That's the point. But to give this a news point is that they announced there would be a meeting in Budapest, and then it was even penciled in for October the 28th, exactly 1 week from now, in Budapest. The setup would have been set up by Viktor Orban, of course, a well-known admirer of Putin and very much against the EU and NATO's policies on Ukraine. And they were going to settle the ceasefire there. Unfortunately, Trump picked the wrong man to go and set this up, because he sent his foreign minister, in other words, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who has gone there and has been letting it known to organizations like CNN and the Institute for the Study of War. Look at both their websites, saying it, no deal, no possibility, no ceasefire, no peace. I'm rather surprised that this came from conversations with Lavrov, that the Lavrov-Putin team really let the cat out of the bag so soon. At best, what Putin was looking for is what you and I would call, in military circles, an operational pause. So he could regather at the end of a grueling summer-autumn campaign, which has not gained, frankly, all that much. Huge losses on all sides. And I think that's really what Putin was about. Very interestingly, what Rubio is saying, I think we're going to have a rerun of Alaska. And now you and I can talk about what really did happen in Alaska. But it's not looking good.
Yeah. So, do you think the meeting is actually going to go ahead, or do you think with Marco Rubio going and trying to set all this up, he's effectively turning around and saying, "It ain't going to happen, folks."
No, because what Rubio has said, which is what happened when they whipped off the covers at Alaska, is the position hasn't changed. It's the position laid out by Russia for the Istanbul talks weeks after the initial invasion. I think it was April of March, April. It was due to they did take place in 22, where what we want is a neutral, emasculated, demilitarized Ukraine, really part of the Russian sphere of influence, part of the Russian entity, which is what we have to talk about a lot more, Philip. There's an abstract view of what Russia is and where Russia is in the world, and it isn't bounded by boundaries on the map. I hadn't thought of it so clearly as about in these terms until I was talking to some brilliant Ukrainian colleagues, former intelligence academics at King's College London last night. And they were very clear, and they had done deep think tank stuff for people like Budanov in Ukraine, looking what the future was. And the leading lady there, who had been a negotiator, who by birth is Ukrainian Russian, not uncommon, educated in the Soviet system, as she said, "Look, oh Westerners," she was more or less saying to, I think, you frame this in far too much classical geopolitical lines on maps war, the kind of thinking that you had in Paris in the talks at the end of the First World War, even what was being talked of in the setup of the United Nations and that process, which led us into the Cold War in the 1940s. Russia is Russia, and the idea with Putin is dominant. It has a dominant role, and we don't really know where it stops. And I think that that's what Western allies, and particularly Britain, and I don't see much thinking going on like this, is where we do stick to people having sovereignty within their own boundaries and the self-determination of the people. We have to ask, where does this stop with Russia? The Putin scheme. Now, the Ukrainian colleagues talking to, there were 3 colleagues talking to King's College yesterday, had a very, very interesting take on this, and it may be well worth going into it. And it's rather different from what we're hearing, but I think we should hear a lot more of this interpretation of that geopolitical scene, because it's a very large region that the way that the very aggressive, very front foot Putin Russia first policy pushes them. And it's quite clear that Trump, in his thinking, is a bit player. It's somebody he can use. It's somebody he can instrumentalize. It's quite regionally based, but it's a very big region. It's a geopolitical region of Eurasia. We're going to be the most powerful military nation in Central Europe and Asia, and that has to be respected. Reality is beginning to tell us otherwise in view of what's happening to the Russian economy, not least.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because if we go back to 2003, when Putin started his information operation against Ukraine, in some of his speeches, he talked of the Ukrainians as being little Russians. And he used, in linguistic terms, he used little Russians to suggest that they were all one people. The Ukrainians and the Russians were the same people. But he used the word little in there to belittle them and basically say, if we were looking at this in Indian culture, you're a lower caste of Russians. So you're Russians, but you're a lower caste, which sort of ties in with what you were saying. What else were those academics saying last night about the Russian psyche, the Russian culture? And do you think Western intelligence is failing once again by not thinking of things from a Russian and a Putin's perspective, but trying to put things into the typical Western little boxes that you can put symbols in and lines on maps and various other things?
Well, I think that in intelligence, particularly with things like the Defence Intelligence Department, say in the UK MOD, it's very granular. It's very, I mean, we had a brief from them the other day, and it was very interesting. You couldn't push the boundaries on the economy, the state of the weather, which has been affecting the fighting so much, so dramatically recently, the state of the harvest, fuel, food, the bigger picture. That's rather an indication of the granularity. But just to go back to the point that you have made very well about the Putin view of Ukraine from 2003, and by the way, information ops is the propaganda, fake news, whatever, is absolutely meat and drink to him. That was followed through in the famous July 2021 essay leading up to the invasion. And it was the idea of the role of Ukraine and Belarus in the greater Russian idea and identity. And the rare shades of Novorussia, of Catherine the Great. We have to mention this because this is music. This is the great symphonic background to what Putin is doing. Now, what the trio, who are brilliant, were pointing out is that they had done 7 scenarios for what happens in the future. 75% consensus of the people that they consulted, well, a whole range of experts and people, hands-on people. The war goes on for 18 months more, at least. That is the general. That was the general view of it. But the intriguing thing that I heard from a former head of protocol of the Ukrainian presidency, actually at the time of even of Viktor Yanukovych, but very, very experienced, done it for years and years and years, very thoughtful. His view was that it's something grander than the scheme of maneuver, the concept of what Putin is going to do. It isn't just push, pull, prod on Ukraine, do a diversionary, a false flag in the Baltics, although I think, by the way, we're not paying nearly enough attention to how vulnerable the Baltics are, because I do think there are signs of adventures coming off there. But this guy put it very interestingly. He said, where we are, and the Trump rhetoric actually has an awful echo here, we are looking at a kind of World War III. In other words, he said it's a global canvas of a war of hybridity that is hybrid in a way we are not fully understanding. And he had some chilling things. For instance, the timing of the attack of the American-Israeli bombing of Iran. And you can see these things that they are as they would say in physics, they're vibrating sympathetically at the moment. And I find that a very useful tool, a very useful way to think of it, because particularly when you look at what's going on in the Western Balkans at the moment, and by the way, as usual, that the thing doesn't go to railway timetables, in that I think they've got real problems with Srpska at the moment. Whether they save the guy or donate or not is going to be a big thing. But I think that there is this scheme, and you can see enduring personalities, and they have remarkably similar modus operandi, Modi operandi. The one that they mentioned, of course, is we hear a lot from him, and he's always negative, is Sergei Lavrov. And they said, really is, go back to the early Cold War days, he's the Andrew Gromyko of the very, very long-lasting foreign minister of the Sovereign, who was just known as Mr. Niet, the no. But Mr. Niet actually rather overplayed his hand. He was very jokey at Alaska at that meeting, because he suddenly sort of flashed open his jacket, his wind cheater, to show that he was wearing the old Soviet Union ice hockey international team a sweatshirt. In allegedly setting this up with Rubio. Rubio is no Witkoff in this way. He wasn't having anything of it. He knew nothing had changed, and that Russia was still bent on conquest and destroying Ukraine. Therefore, and I bet the three colleagues, money was not exchanged, that the thing won't happen. in Budapest on the 28th. It will be, pardon my not French, but deep Latin. It will be postponed sine die. It will be, well, it's postponed. It's not cancelled. You know, the stars didn't align, you know, and it's very muddy and whatever, whatever. But that would be an embarrassment for Viktor Orban, because the suspicion was that the side play, the side dish, and a very big one of this, would be Putin going to Budapest and really, with as one of the colleagues was saying, that there will be, you know, planes full of goodies for Orban. And by golly, it would be another intelligence and otherwise propaganda penetration of the NATO EU space. But mind you, talking of the NATO and EU space, I think they've more or less written off Orban right now. And I think that's going to be very interesting. And one of the things you and I should be pursuing now is, I think, there's a realignment of Europe, of security Europe. And it's very, very interesting who's going to be at the top of the tree. And in the senior players there, the most difficult one is undoubtedly the UK.
Yeah. Well, this is where UK is in this bridging position between the United States and Europe, because Brexit has us out of Europe, but we're in NATO. We're also the only other Five Eyes or European Five Eyes member that's sitting there, which European countries are very jealous of. And within the EU itself, you know, whilst there isn't a defence pact, the majority of EU countries are members of NATO, which there is a European defence element to NATO. But then there's a couple of players, you know, Austria and Ireland, who are EU members who are not in that. Do you think Putin recognises all of these fraction points?
Ireland will never state it, but Ireland is in the Security Forum. It's so worried about asymmetric.
Yes, and the new head of the EU's military commission is Irish General Casey. And he now heads up the European military, even though Ireland itself doesn't contribute to a lot of military capability. But, you know, in looking at that, do you think Putin is sitting there in classical terms going, there's so many fracture points in what's going on in the West, this is going to be easy for me to spin things up and keep people running around in circles and allow me effectively to get on with what I want? And do you think a lot of the hybrid stuff that we've seen recently with drones over Germany and Denmark and Sweden, and intelligent ships over undersea cables and various other things that are happening, do you think all of that is Putin just testing the ground?
Well, he's been doing that, but it's when he wants to go a step further, and it's quite clear that it could happen very soon, because if there are further incursions, the EU, NATO, the hardcore, and it would be around the Joint Expeditionary Force, plus Germany, plus Finland, who are very, very strong indeed, and you know, they could match anything in terms of the armored battlefield that very soon that Russia could put in the field. But it's what the probing really adds up to. What I fear is that it could spill over, because they could do a little bit green man job, putting in strange people in strange uniforms into Estonia. I think it's going to be the target, in the way that they did in Crimea in 2014. And I think it could trigger something quite quickly. It'll be a real test for Trump, for which Trump and the increasingly bizarre Pete Hegseth seem absolutely unprepared for, and they're distracted by all kinds of things. Obviously, Gaza, because he sent part of the A team off there, Vitkov and his son-in-law Kushner. But what is he doing with Venezuela? What is the CIA really up to? Venezuela, Colombia, particularly when you have a ranking commander, the commander of Southern Command. I believe he wasn't sacked. They said that he had been replaced. No, he didn't. He resigned. So what did he resign about? So Trump is all over the place, like an elephant trying to negotiate an ice skating rink at the moment. And I think that they've read the lessons. I think, key players, I mean, the obvious ones who are really making quite a lot of sensible noise are Mark Rutte, uh, Kallas of Estonia, but the EU foreign minister, and very powerful figures, as it turns out, like Mette Frederiksen, the PM of Denmark. Their position is quite clear that they think they are in danger, they're at great risk from Russia. But Frederiksen, of course, is having no truck with Trump because he wants to bag part of Danish or Danish interest territory, Greenland. So therefore, we're building up air defense systems. We need it. And I wonder if the UK is learning from this. I fear not, that it needs quite close air defense systems against missile or even armed drone attack. And Frederiksen is having nothing to do with the Americans on that. It's innovating a lot of its own stuff, which it is doing with Ukraine, and it's not buying American, it's buying European. That's where we are going at the moment. What the report back to Trump and where Trump goes from this, I do not know, because it's pretty clear what the 2-hour conversation with Putin was about. I think it was on the 17th, and it was, look here, Donald, Tovarich, don't send tomahawks. And he was dead scared that he might have been tempted to do that. The thing that was frightening, I understand, from the subsequent conversation the day after with Zelensky, is that Trump talked to all of Putin's talking points.
Yep.
There's a funny thing.
He's done that before, and your analysis about the little green men, I think you're right on that, but I see a different target, and we'll talk about this in a different program sometime. But I see the different target as being Ireland. But again, I threw that out there for something we'll talk about in the future. However, do you think what went wrong in the latest talks was we had Trump speaking to Putin, and almost immediately, the very next day, we had Trump speaking to Zelensky. And what didn't happen was what had happened beforehand when you'd Trump with Putin in Alaska. Then you had the European and NATO leaders going and spending a lot of time with Trump and putting big effort in there. And then Trump, Zelensky, and Trump seems to change his mind. Now you haven't had that European influence. You haven't had that other global leaders and NATO leaders going in to try and reimplant certain things back in his mind again. And something like that has to happen. And do you think they need to very quickly get in a plane and go and see Donald Trump and sort him out before this Budapest, this meeting in Hungary? Yeah, Budapest, whether it happens or not.
No, I think it's a lost cause. I mean, because you have to go through the Alice in Wonderland logic of Trumpland there, and I don't think they can be bothered with it because they've got to go on supporting Ukraine. This is absolutely clear. Don't wait for America. And the message is that the intermediate range missiles, not that we've heard much about them, the Flamingo, but certainly the longer range drones are really having an effect. And this is where Putin is, I think, being very blind as to what the effect is. I mean, I've been reading Steve Rosenberg's, press report from the Daily Press, and it's getting through that, that transportation is now affected, retail, gasoline and diesel is not so available. The intelligence services, by the way, have been remarkably silent in what the effect has been on the harvest, what there has been of it. It's 20% in Ukraine, which is big. But have they had the fuel for and the crews for the combine harvesters? We've been hearing stuff about that. This is where the Twitter sphere really does come into its own. 98% of it is 24-carat rubbish, but you just get these little glimmerings of what's going on, and it's the further edge. It's tomahawk range, but they can do it with other things, including with their own little green men. That when those sort of things, the big transmission lines of gas and oil, become even more vulnerable as the winter comes on, that's going to be the real test for Russia. And I'm afraid to say the message for Europe, the Germanys, the France, and even the UK, but Germany, France, and the Scandinavians have been particularly good, namely Denmark. They've got to arm up Ukraine for air defense, and that's the way they're going to build. Ukraine itself, it doesn't solve the problem for them because Ukraine has got a huge personnel problem, and we understand that. But they're staying in the fight, and they're staying in the fight in a way that I think constitutionally that is not quite appreciated in the European West, least of all in the United States. What Putin aims at cannot be done, will not be done by any independent sovereign government in Ukraine, which is the articles now enshrined in their constitution that they aspire to join NATO or EU, probably both. That is now a fundamental, the independence of Ukraine, which Mr. Putin, Russia recognized in the Budapest Agreement when Ukraine agreed to disarm nuclear arms.
Well, yes, and Russia now seems to have brought into its constitution, the bits of Ukraine that it's occupying, and the bits of Ukraine in the Donbass region that it has failed to occupy so far, and saying that that's now part of Russia. So we're going to get into this constitutional battle, which Donald Trump seems to be supporting the Russian line in many cases. Can you see a solution? You talked of 18 months. Of further fighting, but can you see a solution actually appearing in 18 months' time?
No. Well, it will go on, and I think that's why they have to realise that Russia is, as currently constituted, if Putin and his inner claque, and they're beginning to fade away. We hear that Borshnikov, the head of the FSB, is not well, and so on, and he's slightly changing the order of the negotiators because he's woken up too late. That the thing you have to talk to Trump about above all is money first and real estate. So you get people like Uchikov coming into the negotiating team, less of the hard man. But what you are going to get if he gets his army of between 1.5 and 2 million, all told, which he aspires to by the spring with the reserve army and so on, with the regular call out month now, Putin, is going to have to declare martial law. And I think that will change the thing altogether. Then it becomes what it is, covertly already, a military dictatorship. How is he going to manage that? How does he manage the great sort of fan dance, how he wanted to show himself as the victory, his equivalent to Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize? His equivalent was a triumph in time for the Duma elections and the other elections across the regions next year. There is very little he can show at the moment, which is outright victory. And that is part of back to where we are, the psychology of the Russian psyche. The Russian psyche, dominant and victorious. It's not looking quite so victorious, and not looking, in funny ways, quite as dominant as it did in January 2022 on the eve of the invasion and the 10-day special military operation.
Well, Robert, on that point, which is positive in some ways and negative in other ways, it means we've got an awful lot more to discuss over an unfortunately longer period of time. But it's been a real pleasure talking to you once again on Times Radio Frontline today.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.